Sometimes, the person who saves you doesn't even know they're already protecting your heart. The city moved fast, indifferent, headlights slicing through the late evening like quiet comets, engines humming beneath a sky that couldn't decide if it wanted to rain, and Lily Harper stood at the edge of a crosswalk clutching her worn canvas bag, the strap digging into her shoulder, her breath shallow from a 12-hour shift that still wasn't enough to cover next month's rent, her mind replaying numbers she couldn't make add up. The flicker of the pedestrian signal counting down and glowing. Red digits. 5, 4, 3. While a distant car turned the corner a little too quickly, its headlights washing over her vision for just a second too long. Long enough for hesitation to creep into her step. Long enough for everything to feel slightly off. Like the world had tilted half an inch in the wrong direction. And then, before she could even process the instinct to move, a firm hand caught her wrist, steady, unshaking, pulling her back with precise control. Not rough, not forceful, just exact, like whoever it belonged to had already calculated the moment before it happened. She stumbled one step backward, her shoulder brushing against a solid chest, the faint scent of clean cotton and something darker, like cedar or rain-soaked pavement, grounding her faster than her thoughts could, and when she looked up, her eyes met his. Ethan Cole. Though she didn't know his name yet, didn't know the quiet gravity behind his stillness, only that his gaze was sharp but calm, like he had already moved on from the moment while she was still catching up to it. "You're good," he said, voice low, even, as if nothing unusual had just happened, as if pulling someone out of harm's way was just another detail in a long list of unnoticed actions. And Lily blinked, her heart still racing in her chest, trying to piece together what had just happened. The car already gone, the street returning to its rhythm, everything continuing like nothing had almost changed. I think so," she managed, her voice quieter than she expected, her fingers still curled where his hand had been a second ago, the warmth lingering in a way that didn't make sense, and he gave a small nod, already stepping back, already putting distance between them, like proximity itself was something he measured carefully, something he controlled. There was no dramatic pause, no lingering glance, just a subtle shift in his posture as he turned slightly toward the sidewalk, as if he had somewhere else to be, somewhere more important than explaining why he had been exactly there, exactly then. Lily opened her mouth, ready to say, "Thank you," ready to ask something. Anything. But the words tangled before they could form, because something about him didn't invite questions, didn't offer explanations, and before she could find the right sentence, he was already moving, blending into the flow of people like he had never stepped out of it, leaving behind only the echo of a moment that felt too precise to be coincidence. She stood there for another second longer than necessary, the countdown at the crosswalk resetting, the noise of the city swelling back into place. And for a brief, inexplicable instant, she felt like she had just been watched over, not in a way that made her uneasy, but in a way that made her wonder how long it had been happening, and why. Because she hadn't noticed him before, not once, not in the coffee shop she passed every morning, not outside the diner where she worked late shifts, not in the quiet corners of a life that had never felt important enough to be observed, and yet something about the way he had moved, the way he had known exactly when to step in, lingered in her mind like a question without an answer, while across the street, Ethan slowed for just half a second, barely noticeable, his eyes flicking once over his shoulder to confirm she was safe, his jaw tightening in a way he didn't fully register, before he continued walking, already dismissing the moment, already filing it away as routine, unaware that the slight shift in his chest, the one he chose not to name, had already begun to change everything. The next morning, the city looked different, or maybe Lily Harper just could not shake the feeling that something unseen had shifted overnight, because as she pushed open the door to the small diner on 8th Street, the familiar chime above it echoing softly, she caught herself glancing over her shoulder, not out of fear, but out of curiosity, like she half expected to see him again, the man from the crosswalk, the one who had appeared at exactly the right second and disappeared just as quickly. And the thought lingered longer than it should have as she tied her apron, smoothing down the creases of her second-hand blouse, forcing herself back into routine, into the rhythm she knew how to survive in. "You are late by 3 minutes," her manager called from behind the counter, not unkindly, just matter of fact, and Lily nodded, already reaching for a coffee pot, already moving, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering how close she had come to something she could not fully name. Across the diner, sunlight filtered through the front windows, catching dust in the air, turning it into something almost beautiful, and for a moment, everything felt normal again. Orders called out, plates clinking, the low hum of conversation wrapping around her like a familiar blanket. But then she noticed something small, something that should not have stood out, and yet did. A man sitting alone in the far corner booth, not looking at his phone, not eating, just watching the room with a kind of quiet awareness that felt out of place, like he was observing rather than participating. And her chest tightened slightly as recognition flickered. Not because she could clearly see his face from that distance, but because something about the stillness matched the memory from the night before. She turned away quickly, telling herself it was nothing, just another customer, just another face in a city full of strangers. But when she returned with a pot of coffee, her steps slowed just enough for doubt to creep back in. And this time, when she glanced up, their eyes met, unmistakably, undeniably. And there was no confusion now, it was him. Ethan did not react the way most people would. There was no awkward smile, no attempt to acknowledge coincidence, just a subtle shift in his gaze, like he had already accounted for this moment, like her. Noticing him was simply the next step in something he had quietly anticipated, and Lily felt a strange mix of relief and unease settle in her chest. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice steady despite the questions building beneath it, and he nodded once, his expression calm, almost unreadable. "Black," he said, the single word carrying the same controlled tone as the night before, and as she poured, she became aware of how deliberate his presence felt, how nothing about him seemed accidental, not the way he sat, not the way he watched, not even the timing of when he looked away, as if he was careful not to linger too long. "We met yesterday," she said before she could stop herself, the words slipping out softer than she intended, and for a brief second, something changed in his expression, not surprise, not denial, just a flicker of something quieter, something he chose not to fully reveal. "We crossed paths," he replied, the phrasing distant, almost precise, and Lily frowned slightly. Because that was not how people usually described pulling someone out of danger. But before she could press further, another order was called, another distraction pulling her back in emotion, and when she turned away, she felt it again, that subtle awareness, like eyes following her not with intensity, but with intention. Throughout the morning, small things began to stand out in ways they never had before. A spilled drink that she somehow managed to avoid without thinking, a tray that almost slipped but did not, a customer who grew impatient but calmed just as quickly as he had started, each moment minor on its own, each one explainable, and yet together they formed a pattern that made her pause, made her wonder if she was imagining things or if something just beyond her understanding was quietly adjusting the edges of her day. And every time she looked toward the corner booth, Ethan was still there, not interfering, not stepping in, just present, like a constant she had not known existed, while inside him, something equally subtle was shifting, a quiet tension he could not quite place, because watching her, ensuring she was safe, had never felt like a decision, it had always felt like instinct, and for the first time, he found himself questioning why. By late afternoon, the diner had settled into that slower, quieter rhythm where the sunlight stretched longer across the floor and conversations softened into background noise, and Lily found herself stealing glances toward the corner booth more often than she wanted to admit, not because she needed to, but because something about Ethan's presence refused to fade into the ordinary, like a detail her mind kept circling back to without permission. He had not ordered anything beyond coffee, had not checked his phone, had barely moved except to occasionally shift his gaze, and yet it never felt idle, never careless. Every movement measured in a way that made her feel both observed and oddly reassured at the same time. A contradiction she could not quite explain. When her shift finally slowed enough for her to breathe, she wiped her hands on her apron and walked over, not out of obligation, but because curiosity had grown too loud to ignore. "You have been here all day," she said, keeping her tone light, though there was an edge of something more beneath it, and Ethan looked up at her with the same calm expression, as if time did not weigh on him the way it did on everyone else. "I had time," he replied simply, and the answer felt incomplete, like a sentence missing its most important part. Lily crossed her arms slightly, leaning just enough to show she was not leaving without something more. "Most people do not spend 8 hours in a diner with 1 cup of coffee," she said, a small hint of a smile softening the words. And for a brief moment, something shifted in his gaze again, something almost like amusement, though it did not fully reach the surface. "Most people are not you," he said, and the response caught her off guard, not because of what it meant, but because of how certain it sounded, like he had already drawn conclusions about her that she had not shared. She blinked, searching his face for a sign of a joke, but there was none, only that same quiet certainty, and it made her pulse quicken in a way she could not quite place. Before she could respond, a sudden clatter echoed from behind the counter, a stack of plates slipping from someone's grip, but instead of shattering, they stopped just short of the edge, caught in time by a coworker who had not even been looking a second before, and Lily turned instinctively, her breath catching for just a second, because it was another one of those moments, another near miss that resolved itself too perfectly, too precisely, and when she looked back at Ethan, he was already watching her, not the plates, not the noise, just her, as if her reaction mattered more than the event itself. "Does that happen a lot?" she asked quietly, the question leaving her before she could filter it, and Ethan tilted his head slightly, considering. "Things almost going wrong?" he clarified, and she nodded, her fingers tightening slightly against her arm. "Lately, yes," she admitted, and for the first time, his expression shifted into something more serious, something thoughtful, like he was weighing how much to say, how much to hold back. "Maybe you are just noticing more," he said, and the answer should have been reassuring, should have been simple, but it was not, because it felt like he knew something she did not, something just beyond her reach. The air between them grew quieter for a moment, not awkward, but charged with unspoken questions, and Lily felt a strange pull to stay there, to keep talking, even though she did not know what she was trying to uncover, while inside Ethan, that same quiet tension tightened again, because every instinct told him to keep distance, to remain unseen, to let his actions speak without explanation, and yet standing this close to her, hearing her voice, watching the way she tried to make sense of things she could not see, made that distance harder to maintain than it should have been. "Why were you there last night?" she asked finally, her voice softer now, more careful, and this time, Ethan did not answer immediately, his gaze holding hers for a second longer than before, as if the truth sat just beneath the surface, waiting to be acknowledged, but instead, he exhaled quietly and said, "Wrong place at the right time." And something about the way he said it made Lily realize that was not entirely true, not even close. And as he stood, placing a few bills on the table that were far more than the cost of a single cup of coffee, she felt it again, that subtle shift in the air, like something important had almost been revealed but slipped away at the last second, leaving behind only the feeling that whatever was happening around her was not random at all, and whatever role Ethan played in it, he was not ready to let her see it yet. The night stretched longer than usual, the city quieter in the way it only became after midnight, when even the constant hum of traffic softened into something distant and almost forgettable, and Lily walked the final blocks toward her apartment building with slower steps, her mind replaying the day in fragments she could not quite organize, the man in the diner, the way he spoke, the way he watched, the way everything around her seemed to shift just slightly out of sync with what should have happened. She reached the entrance of her building, an aging structure with chipped paint and a flickering hallway light visible through the glass door, and paused for a moment before stepping inside, her reflection faint in the surface, her expression more thoughtful than tired now, as if something deeper had taken hold of her attention. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of old carpet and cleaning supplies, familiar and grounding, and she climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, each step echoing softly, each movement returning her to the version of her life she understood, predictable, manageable, untouched by whatever quiet pattern had started forming beyond her awareness. She unlocked her door, stepped into the small apartment, and exhaled slowly, dropping her bag onto the chair near the window, the space modest but hers, a place where nothing unexpected usually happened. And yet tonight, even here, something felt different, like the edges of her world had been gently adjusted without her permission. Across the city, Ethan remained in his office. The lights dimmed now except for the soft glow of multiple screens casting subtle reflections across the glass walls. His posture unchanged, but his focus sharper, more intent, as he tracked the final moments of Lily's walk home. Each camera feed transitioning seamlessly into the next, each angle confirming what he needed to know before he allowed himself even a fraction of distance. His assistant stood a few feet away, silent at first, watching the sequence unfold with a quiet understanding that this was no longer just observation, no longer routine. And when he finally leaned back slightly, exhaling as Lily's apartment door closed on the screen, she spoke carefully. "You have extended coverage beyond standard parameters." And Ethan did not deny it, did not deflect, his eyes still fixed on the now still frame, as if the absence of movement carried its own kind of importance. "Adjust the perimeter grid," he said instead, his tone calm but firm, "no direct visibility into private space." And she nodded once, already making the necessary changes. Because even within this controlled system, there were lines he would not cross, boundaries he enforced not out of policy, but out of something more personal, something that had begun to shape itself without his full awareness. Back in her apartment, Lily moved toward the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to let the city lights spill into the room, her gaze drifting across the street below, not searching for anything specific, just following the instinct that had been growing stronger with each passing hour. And for a brief moment, she thought she saw something, a figure standing across the street, partially obscured by shadow, still, unmoving, and her breath caught slightly, not in fear, but in recognition of the feeling it brought, that same quiet awareness that she was not entirely unseen, not entirely alone. She blinked, focusing, but the figure was gone, replaced by nothing more than the empty sidewalk and the faint glow of a streetlight, and she let out a slow breath, shaking her head gently as if to clear the thought, telling herself it was just her imagination, just the result of a long day and too many coincidences layered too closely together. She stepped back from the window, pulling the curtain closed, trying to return to something normal, something grounded, but as she moved through the small space, setting her things down, turning on a lamp, the feeling did not leave. It stayed just beneath the surface, subtle but persistent, like a question that had not yet found its answer. While miles away, Ethan finally turned away from the screens, his reflection catching briefly in the darkened glass, his expression composed, controlled, but not untouched, because even as he stepped back into the world he understood, structured, predictable, entirely within his control, one truth lingered quietly beneath everything else, something he had not said out loud, something he had not fully allowed himself to think, that somewhere between the first moment he pulled her back from the street and now, protecting her had stopped being a task and had become something else entirely, something he could not yet define, but could no longer ignore. The next morning arrived quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that did not come from the absence of sound, but from something shifting beneath it. And Lily woke earlier than she needed to, her eyes opening before her alarm, her mind already alert in a way that felt unfamiliar, as if part of her had stayed awake through the night, watching, listening, waiting for something she could not fully explain. She lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling, replaying the image from her window, the figure that might have been there or might have only existed in the space between exhaustion and imagination. And the more she thought about it, the less certain she became, which only made the feeling stronger, not weaker, because uncertainty had a way of filling in its own answers. She sat up slowly, pulling the blanket aside, her feet touching the cold floor, grounding her back into reality, into the version of her life that made sense, where rent was due in a week, where shifts needed to be covered, where nothing extraordinary had ever truly belonged. And yet, even as she moved through her small morning routine, brushing her hair, pouring coffee into a chipped mug, checking her phone with no new messages, the sense of being observed lingered just beneath the surface, subtle but persistent, like a shadow she could not quite see. Across the city, Ethan had not slept, not in the way most people understood sleep. Because while his body had remained still for a few hours, his mind had stayed active, processing, recalculating, reviewing every detail from the day before, not out of necessity, but out of instinct, the same instinct that had guided his actions without question until now, until something about it began to feel different, less controlled, less defined. He stood once again in front of the screens, though. This time, there was hesitation in the way his hand hovered before activating the feed, a pause that had never existed before, because for the first time, he was aware of the line between observation and intrusion, and the fact that he had been walking it so precisely without ever acknowledging it. The screen flickered to life, showing the exterior of Lily's building, the early morning light casting long shadows across the sidewalk. And a few seconds later, she appeared, stepping out into the day with that same quiet determination he had come to recognize, her movements simple, unguarded, unaware of how closely they had been mapped, studied, anticipated. "You are still doing it," the voice behind him said again, softer this time, less questioning and more certain, and Ethan did not turn, his eyes fixed on the screen, as if looking away might disrupt something fragile, something newly forming. "It is temporary," he replied, though the words felt less convincing than before, even to himself, and the woman behind him remained silent for a moment before adding, "You said that yesterday." And that was enough to make him pause, just for a second, just long enough for the truth to surface without permission. Down on the street, Lily adjusted the strap of her bag and began walking toward the bus stop, her steps steady, but her gaze more aware than it had been days before, because now she was looking, not just moving, noticing the small details, the reflections in windows, the timing of passing cars, the subtle patterns that had started to emerge. And as she reached the corner, she slowed slightly, her eyes scanning the opposite side of the street, and for a brief second, she saw him. Again, not clearly, not fully, just enough to recognize the shape, the stillness, the presence. And this time, she did not look away. Her heart picked up, not in fear, but in certainty, because whatever this was, whatever pattern had been forming around her, it was real, and it was connected to him. She took a small step forward, as if to confirm it, to close the distance between assumption and truth, but just like before, the moment shifted, the figure disappearing into the movement of the city, leaving behind nothing but the echo of a presence she could no longer dismiss. Above, Ethan watched the exact moment she looked across the street, the exact second her awareness aligned with his position, and something in his chest tightened in a way he had not prepared for, because this was not part of the plan, not part of the system he controlled. This was something else, something unpredictable, something that moved beyond calculation, and for the first time, the thought crossed his mind, clear and unavoidable, that she was getting closer to the truth, and he was not entirely sure what would happen when she finally reached it. She did not wait for the bus that morning, not because she had somewhere else to be, but because something inside her had shifted from passive awareness into quiet determination, and Lily stepped back from the curb, her eyes scanning the street again, more intentionally this time, no longer dismissing what she saw as coincidence, no longer willing to let the moment slip away the way it had before. And as the flow of people moved around her, she stayed still, grounded, watching. The city did what it always did. Cars passed, footsteps echoed, conversations blurred into background noise, but beneath all of it, she felt that same presence again, not obvious, not intrusive, just there, like a thread woven into the pattern of everything else. And this time, instead of turning away, she stepped toward it. Across the street, Ethan saw the exact moment her behavior changed, the shift in her posture, the way her movement slowed, then redirected, no longer following routine but searching. And a quiet alertness sharpened his focus instantly, because this was no longer passive observation. This was interaction. This was the point where distance began to collapse, and for the first time, his control over the situation felt less absolute. "She is deviating from her route," his assistant said calmly, already tracking the change, but Ethan did not respond, his attention fixed entirely on Lily as she crossed the street without hesitation, her steps steady, deliberate, closing the space that had always remained just out of reach. She stopped on the opposite sidewalk, her eyes scanning once more, and then she saw him, not as a shadow this time, not as a suggestion of presence, but clearly, unmistakably, standing near the corner of a building, exactly where she had sensed him before, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The distance between them was no longer measured in blocks or screens or unseen layers of protection. It was real, immediate, undeniable. And Lily felt her pulse rise, not from fear, but from the weight of finally standing inside the question she had been circling for days. She took another step closer, her voice steady despite the tension building beneath it. "You have been following me," she said, not as an accusation, but as a conclusion, and Ethan met her gaze without looking away, without denying it, because denial would have been meaningless now, the truth already standing between them. "I have been making sure you are safe," he replied, his tone calm, controlled, but lacking the distance it had before, because something about this moment refused to stay within the boundaries he had set. Lily frowned slightly, the words settling in a way that did not feel comforting. "That is not the same thing," she said quietly, and he did not argue, because she was right, even if he had not allowed himself to define the difference until now. The air between them held a quiet intensity, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. And for the first time, Lily saw past the surface, past the stillness and control, into something more complex, something that did not fit neatly into the idea of a stranger stepping in at the right moment. "Why me?" she asked, the question simple, direct, but carrying everything she did. Not yet understand, and Ethan hesitated, not because he did not have an answer, but because the answer itself was not complete, not something he had fully processed, and that hesitation said more than any explanation could. "Because you needed it," he said finally, though even as the words left him, he knew they were only part of the truth, and Lily's expression shifted, not convinced, not satisfied, because she could feel it too, that something deeper existed beneath the surface, something he was not saying, something he might not even realize yet. She exhaled slowly, her gaze holding his for a moment longer before she stepped back slightly, creating space again, not physically, but emotionally. "I did not ask for this," she said, her voice softer now, but firm, and Ethan felt the weight of that statement settle in a way he could not dismiss, because for all his precision, for all his control, this was the part he had not accounted for, the part where intention met consequence, where protection crossed into something else entirely. As Lily turned, not running, not retreating, just choosing to step away on her own terms, Ethan remained where he was, his posture unchanged, but something inside him shifting in a way that could not be reversed, because for the first time, he was no longer observing her from a distance. He was standing in front of her reality, and it was no longer clear whether what he was doing was helping her or changing her life in ways he could not control. The space she left behind did not feel empty. It felt louder, heavier, like something important had just been interrupted before it could fully form. And Ethan stood there for a moment longer than necessary, his gaze fixed on the direction Lily had walked, not following, not stopping her, just letting the distance exist for the first time without trying to close it. And that choice, that single moment of restraint, felt more unfamiliar than anything else he had done so far. Across the street, Lily kept walking, her pace steady but her thoughts anything but, the conversation replaying in fragments that refused to settle into something simple, because nothing about what he said felt entirely wrong, and yet none of it felt right either, and the truth sat somewhere in between, just out of reach, pressing against her instincts in a way that made her chest tighten slightly with every step. She turned the corner, blending back into the rhythm of the city, but the awareness did not fade this time. It sharpened, because now she knew, now there was a name, a face, a presence she could no longer dismiss as coincidence. And with that knowledge came a new question she had not been asking before, not just why he was doing it, but what it meant if he stopped. High above the streets, Ethan returned to his office without speaking, the silence following him in a way it never had before, because for the first time, his systems felt incomplete, not because they lacked coverage, but because he had chosen not to use them, and that decision lingered in the air longer than any command he could have given. His assistant watched him carefully, her expression neutral but attentive, waiting for the instruction that usually came without hesitation, but this time, there was none, only a pause, a long one, Before he finally spoke, "Disable active monitoring," he said, the words precise, deliberate, and the weight behind them unmistakable, because it was not a technical adjustment, it was a shift in intent. "All of it?" she asked quietly, and Ethan nodded once, his gaze steady. Even as something beneath it shifted, "All of it," he confirmed, and within seconds, the screens dimmed, the feeds going dark one by one, the carefully constructed network of observation dissolving into silence, leaving behind nothing but reflection in the glass, his own image staring back at him with a clarity he had not faced before. Down on the street, Lily slowed again, not because she felt watched, but because she did not, and that absence struck her immediately, like stepping into a room where a constant sound had suddenly stopped, leaving behind a silence that felt unfamiliar, almost unsettling. And she paused near a storefront window, her eyes scanning instinctively, searching for something she could not see anymore. Her reflection stared back at her, alone this time. No shadow, no presence, just beyond the edge, no subtle alignment of events smoothing the path ahead. Just her, standing in a world that had returned to its natural unpredictability. And for a moment, she did not know how to feel about that. She exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening slightly around the strap of her bag, because independence had always been her reality, her strength, the thing she relied on. And yet now that she had felt something different, even briefly, the contrast lingered in a way she could not ignore. Across the city, Ethan stepped away from the glass, the absence of the screens behind him creating a space he had not experienced in years, a space where control no longer filled every corner. And as he moved toward the door, something within him settled and unsettled at the same time. Because letting go of that control was not weakness, it was choice, and that choice carried a weight he could not measure in data or outcomes. Outside, the city continued as it always did, unpredictable, unscripted, and for the first time since this began, both of them moved through it without the invisible thread that had connected their paths. And yet beneath that separation, something remained, not in surveillance, not in calculated protection, but in the quiet realization forming on both sides, that whatever had started between them could not simply disappear just because it was no longer being controlled. Because some connections, once felt, did not need to be managed to exist, they only needed to be understood. Days passed, not many, just enough for the absence to settle into something real, something that no longer felt temporary, and Lily adjusted to it the way she always adjusted to everything else in her life, quietly, without complaint, returning to her routines, her shifts, her small apartment, the steady rhythm of a life she understood. And yet something remained just beneath the surface, a subtle awareness of what had been there before, the quiet sense of being seen, of being protected in a way she had never asked for but had still felt. And now that it was gone, the difference lingered in the spaces between moments, not overwhelming, not consuming, just present. One evening, as she stepped out of the diner, the sky painted in soft shades of orange and fading blue, she paused for a second on the sidewalk, not searching this time, not expecting anything, just breathing in the air as it was, unfiltered, unpredictable, hers alone. And for the first time since everything had started, she felt something settle inside her, not confusion, not tension, but clarity. Because whatever had existed between her and Ethan had never really been about control or surveillance. It had been about something else, something she could now see more clearly from the distance he had created. Across the city, Ethan stood once again in front of the same window, the same skyline stretching endlessly before him. But the room behind him remained dark, the screens still silent, untouched, and he had not turned them back on, not once, because the decision he had made was not temporary, it was final, and he had accepted it in a way that felt both unfamiliar and necessary. He had gone back to his meetings, his responsibilities, the world that operated on precision and control. But even within that structure, something had shifted, something he could not reduce to numbers or outcomes, and it followed him in the quiet moments, in the pauses between conversations, in the way his attention drifted without permission. That night, he stepped out onto the street, not with a plan, not with a system guiding him, just walking, blending into the same city he had always observed from above. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to exist within it without controlling it, without anticipating every outcome, just moving forward one step at a time. A few blocks away, Lily turned the corner toward her building, her pace steady, her thoughts calm in a way they had not been before, and as she reached the crosswalk, she stopped, not out of caution this time, but out of instinct, the same instinct that had first connected their paths, and when she looked up, she saw him, standing on the opposite side of the street, not hidden, not distant, just there, present in the same space, under the same fading light. For a moment, neither of them moved, the city continuing around them, cars passing, voices blending into the background. But between them, there was something quieter, something more intentional, because this time, there were no cameras, no distance, no invisible layers shaping the moment, only choice. Lily took a step forward first, not hesitant, not unsure, just steady, and Ethan mirrored the movement without thinking, closing the distance naturally, without calculation, until they stood a few feet apart, close enough for the silence to feel like something shared rather than empty. "You stopped," she said softly, not as a question, but as recognition, and Ethan nodded once, his expression open in a way it had not been before. "I had to," he replied, the words simple but carrying everything he had not said before, and Lily held his gaze for a second longer, searching for something she could trust, something real, and this time, she found it, not in what he could offer, not in what he could control, but in what he had chosen to let go of. She exhaled slowly, a small smile forming without effort, because for the first time, the space between them felt equal, not shaped by protection or distance, but by understanding, and as the light changed and the city moved forward around them, they did not rush, they did not force anything.